The wire transfer confirmation came through at 4:47 inches the afternoon, and by the time I slipped my phone back into my jacket pocket and walked across the deck toward the table where my nephew and his wife were sitting, I already knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong. My glass of bourbon sat at the edge of the table exactly where I'd left it, the ice half melted in the Gulf heat. My nephew was laughing at something his wife had said. She had her hand on his arm, and she was smiling at me with that wide, practiced smile she always used when she wanted something. I'd seen that smile 100 times at Christmas dinners and birthday parties and family barbecues. I'd always thought it just meant she was happy. I know better now, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on that boat, you need to understand what I spent my whole life building and why two people who called me family were willing to watch me die for it. My name is Harold, and I am 67 years old. I grew up in a small fishing town on the Louisiana coast, the kind of place where the streets smell like salt water and diesel fuel, and the men who don't fish end up working in the refineries. My father fished. His father fished. His father before that fished. It was what our family did, and there was never any question that I would do it too. What my father didn't plan on was that I would be stubborn enough and foolish enough and, eventually, lucky enough to turn one second-hand trawler into something bigger. I bought my first boat at 24 with a loan I had no business taking out. I worked that boat 7 days a week for 3 years, slept on it half the time, and paid back every cent. Then I bought a second, then a third. By the time I was 40, I had 7 commercial fishing vessels operating in the Gulf. By the time I was 55, I had 14. The fleet had contracts with processing facilities up and down the coast. We had crews, we had insurance, we had accountants and dock managers and a logistics coordinator who made sure the whole thing ran without me having to be on the water every day. I had built something from nothing, the way men of my generation understood that phrase, with actual calluses and actual sleepless nights and actual years of going without things that other people took for granted. My wife Margaret passed away 9 years ago, ovarian cancer. We had no children of our own, though God knows we tried. What we had instead was her sister's boy, Marcus, who came to live with us when he was 11 years old after his parents' marriage collapsed in the particular slow-motion, ugly way that some marriages do. We raised him. I coached his Little League team. I taught him to fish. I sat in the third row at his high school graduation and felt something that I can only describe as the pride of a father, even if the law wouldn't have called me one. When he married Diane 6 years ago, I stood at the back of the church, and I shook his hand afterward, and I told him she seemed like a fine woman. I meant it. She was polished and smart and ambitious, and I thought those were good qualities in a partner for a man I loved like a son. What I didn't understand then was that ambition without conscience is just hunger wearing a dress. I had been thinking about retirement for a couple of years before the offer came. My knees weren't what they used to be. I'd had a minor cardiac event, what my doctor very carefully called a cardiac event to avoid using the word heart attack, 18 months earlier, and it had rearranged my thinking about how I wanted to spend whatever time I had left. I wanted to fish for pleasure instead of profit. I wanted to sit on my porch and watch the water. I wanted to sleep past 5 in the morning for the first time in 4 decades. The buyers were a large seafood conglomerate out of Tampa. They'd been circling for 2 years. When they finally put a real number on the table, it was $5,500,000 for the fleet, the contracts, and the operational infrastructure. My attorney looked over the terms and told me it was a fair deal. My accountant called it generous. I signed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning in early November, and by the following Friday, the wire transfer was confirmed, and I was, for the first time in my adult life, a man with no boats to worry about. I decided to celebrate. That seemed right. 43 years of work deserved at least a dinner. I chartered a private vessel for the evening, a sleek 60-foot yacht called the Magnolia that operated out of a marina about 20 minutes from my waterfront property. I'd been on her before for a client dinner years back, and I remembered her as a graceful boat with a good galley and a crew that knew what they were doing. I booked her for a sunset dinner cruise, just the 3 of us, me and Marcus and Diane, out on the open Gulf with good food and good weather and the kind of horizon that reminds you why you spent your life on the water. Marcus had been excited when I called him. He'd asked about the final sale price 3 times in the same conversation, each time rephrasing the question slightly, as if hoping for a different answer. And I told him the same number all 3 times, without really thinking much about it. He was family. He knew I'd always planned to look after him in my will. There was nothing strange about a nephew being curious about his uncle's finances. That's what I told myself. Diane was dressed beautifully when they arrived at the marina, in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first month's boat payment. She hugged me longer than usual and told me she was so proud of me. Marcus shook my hand and then pulled me into a bear hug and said, "You did it, Uncle Harold. You actually did it." I felt something warm and full in my chest, standing there between them on the dock in the last of the afternoon light. I thought about Margaret and how much she would have loved this moment. I thought about the boy with the terrible haircut I'd taken in at 11 years old, and the man he'd become. I thought about what it meant to have family, real family, the kind you make through years of showing up. I was a fool, but I was a happy fool, for a little while. We boarded the Magnolia just before 5 o'clock. The captain was a quiet, capable man named Ernest, who I remembered from the last time, and his crew consisted of 2 people, a woman who handled the galley and navigation systems, and a young man in his mid-20s named Tommy, who managed the deck and served at the table. Tommy had the easy confidence of someone who was good at their job and knew it without needing to announce it. He showed us to the aft deck, where a table had been set with white linen and proper crystal, got us settled, and asked what we'd like to start with. I ordered a bourbon on the rocks. Marcus ordered the same. Diane asked for a glass of sparkling water and said she might have wine with dinner. We pushed off from the dock at 5:15, and I sat back in my chair and watched the marina shrink behind us and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. 43 years. The gulf spread out in every direction, going gold and orange as the sun dropped, and I was, at that moment, the most peaceful I had been in longer than I could remember. That peace lasted about 40 minutes. My phone rang just after 6. It was my attorney, calling with a minor question about some documentation the buyers needed for the transfer of the operating licenses. It was nothing urgent, but it required me to look up a file number, and my records were in my email. So I excused myself from the table and walked up toward the bow where I could hear better over the wind. I was up there for maybe 8 minutes, maybe 10. The call wrapped up. I found the number my attorney needed, and I stood there for a moment looking out at the water before I headed back. That was when Tommy appeared beside me. He came around the side of the cabin quietly, and for a second I thought he was just passing through. But he stopped, and he looked at me, and even in the fading light I could see that something was sitting heavy on his face. "Mr. Harold," he said, and then he stopped. I waited. "I apologize in advance if I'm out of line," he said, "and if I am, I'd ask you to please tell Captain Ernest, instead of getting me in trouble yourself, because I need this job." He swallowed. "But I was clearing some things from near the table a few minutes ago, and I saw the woman, the one in the cream dress, take something from her clutch and pour it into your glass. I heard the words. I heard every one of them, in order, with perfect clarity, and for a full 4 or 5 seconds, I simply stood there while my brain refused to process what they meant. 'She poured something into my bourbon,' I said. 'Yes, sir, something small, a little vial.' She was quick about it, but I was right there, and I had a clear sight line. I looked back toward the stern where Marcus and Diane were sitting, talking and laughing. The gulf spread out behind them, going dark purple at the edges. 2 people who had hugged me at the marina, 2 people who had told me they were proud of me. I thanked Tommy. I told him he had done the right thing. I told him to go about his work as if nothing had happened, and I would handle it. Then I stood at the bow of the Magnolia for another full minute, breathing salt air, and I understood for the first time in my life what it means when people say the ground shifts under your feet. I walked back to the table slowly and settled into my chair. My bourbon glass was there, full and waiting. Diane was telling Marcus something about a property she'd seen listed in Destin, a waterfront house with a private dock, and she was describing the square footage and the views with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has been thinking about a particular subject for a long time. I looked at my glass. I thought about what Tommy had told me. I thought about Margaret and the way she used to say that people will always show you who they are if you're patient enough to let them. I reached across the table for the bread basket, and in doing so, I knocked my elbow against my glass, catching it before it fell, but managing in that same motion to slide it across the table so that it ended up in front of Diane's sparkling water. I set Diane's glass in front of me instead, apologized for being clumsy, and asked Tommy, who had appeared with our first course on cue, to please bring Diane a fresh sparkling water since I'd gotten the glasses mixed up. Diane looked at the bourbon glass in front of her for just a moment, just a fraction of a second too long. Then she smiled and said, "No worries, Uncle Harold. I ate my dinner. I made conversation. I laughed at the right moments and asked questions about things I didn't actually care about the answers to. And I sat there at a beautifully set table on a 60-foot yacht on the Gulf of Mexico, and I performed the role of a happy, unsuspecting old man with what I believe was a genuinely convincing level of skill. Inside, I was something else entirely. Inside, I was running through every interaction I'd had with Marcus and Diane over the past 2 years. Certain conversations rearranged themselves in my memory. A comment Diane had made at Easter about the estate attorney I'd switched to. A question Marcus had asked 6 months ago about whether I'd updated my will since the cardiac event. An afternoon 3 weeks back, when Diane had stopped by my house unexpectedly, and, she said, just to drop off a casserole, and I'd come home to find her in my office saying she'd been looking for the bathroom, which was in a completely different part of the house. The threads came together quickly. The pattern they made was not a complicated one. About 40 minutes after dinner, Diane said she wasn't feeling well. She said it quietly at first, just a murmur, touching her temple. Then the color left her face in a way that wasn't performed and wasn't subtle. And she gripped the edge of the table and said her vision was blurring. Marcus was beside her immediately, his hand on her shoulder, and for a single, unguarded moment, his expression was not one of concern. It was something else. Something that passed across his face too quickly for him to catch it before he rearranged his features into the look of a worried husband. In that fraction of a second, I understood the full shape of the evening they had planned. They had intended for me to drink what was in that glass. They had intended for me to become incapacitated out here on the water, far from any hospital, and well beyond the point where anyone could intervene quickly. And there had almost certainly been something waiting for me in that scenario. Some documents, some phone call, some arrangement that required my signature or my verbal confirmation of a transfer or a change in instructions that a confused, poisoned old man might give without understanding what he was agreeing to. I sat very still. Tommy came to the stern within seconds of Diane's distress becoming visible. He was calm and efficient, and I saw him look at me once with a question in his eyes. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage. He went to the cabin, and I heard him speak quietly to Captain Ernest. The Magnolia turned back toward shore. Marcus was hovering over Diane, who was now pale and sweating, telling her to breathe, asking her what she felt, and his voice had taken on a frantic quality that I recognized was not entirely about her condition. He kept glancing at me. He kept looking at the bourbon glass that was still sitting in front of Diane, untouched, the ice long since melted. I asked Tommy, when he came back to the table, to please bring me a glass of water. He brought it. And as he set it down, he leaned in just slightly and said, very quietly, near my ear, "Captain already called the marina. Paramedics will be waiting." I squeezed his forearm once. He straightened up and went back to his work. By the time we reached the dock, Diane was barely coherent. She was helped off the boat by Marcus and by one of the marina's dock workers, and the paramedics were there as promised, 2 of them with a gurney and a kit, and they had her on it within 3 minutes. Marcus rode in the ambulance with her. He didn't look back at me when he left, not once. I stood on the dock for a long moment after the ambulance pulled away, watching its taillights disappear around the corner of the marina road. The water lapped quietly against the pilings. The Magnolia sat still behind me. The marina lights reflected in long orange lines across the dark surface of the water. Captain Ernest came and stood beside me without saying anything, which was exactly right. I called my attorney from the dock. Then I called the detective I'd worked with years ago on a workers' compensation fraud case involving one of my dock managers, a sharp, patient woman named Detective Rivera, who had impressed me then with her thoroughness. She answered on the fourth ring, and she listened without interrupting while I told her, in plain and factual language, what Tommy had witnessed, and what I had observed, and what I believed had been planned for that evening. When I finished, she asked me 2 questions. I answered both of them. She told me to stay available, and to not contact Marcus or Diane directly, and to make sure Tommy was willing to give a formal statement. Tommy was willing. I hadn't doubted that he would be. The hospital ran a tox panel on Diane. The results came back the following morning. There was a sedative compound in her system, something in the benzodiazepine family at a dosage that the attending physician described as significantly above therapeutic levels, enough to render a person of average weight completely unresponsive for several hours. Enough, in an elderly person with a pre-existing cardiac condition, to create what the physician carefully characterized as a medically serious situation. The vial, which Tommy had seen clearly enough to describe to Detective Rivera, was traced through a series of steps that I won't claim to understand fully to a prescription that had been written for Diane's mother 2 years earlier and had never been used. The mother's physician confirmed that the prescription had been filled, but that the medication had subsequently gone missing during a period when Diane had been handling her mother's affairs. Marcus and Diane both denied everything for approximately 72 hours. Then their individual stories began to diverge in the particular way that stories do when 2 people, who were once aligned in their deception, start to understand separately that the situation is no longer salvageable, and that cooperation with the investigation might be their best remaining option. What emerged in the following weeks was not complicated. It was just ugly. Marcus had a gambling problem that he had been concealing for 3 years. Not a minor vice or a recreational habit, but a genuine, compulsive, catastrophic problem that had accumulated debts of nearly $400,000 with people who were not especially patient about repayment timelines. Diane had known. Diane had, in fact, been managing the communications with Marcus's creditors, while also managing what she described to investigators as the solution, which was me. They had anticipated my business sale. They had known for months that the deal was coming through, and they had apparently decided, together, that the most efficient path forward was a version of events in which I signed over a significant portion of my assets to Marcus under circumstances in which I was not fully in control of my faculties. After which, if additional documentation was needed, I was simply not in a position to contradict whatever had been arranged on my behalf. They had not, as far as the investigation determined, intended for me to die. They had told themselves, or at least Marcus had told himself, that I would simply wake up confused and unwell, and that by the time I understood what had been signed, the transfers would be complete and the legal situation would be sufficiently tangled that I would be unlikely to successfully challenge them. I'm not certain how much comfort I'm supposed to take from the fact that they hadn't planned to kill me. I've thought about it many times since, and I honestly don't know where the line is between attempted murder and what they actually intended. The physician's assessment of what that dosage might have done to a man my age, with my cardiac history, does not make the distinction feel especially meaningful. Marcus was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial abuse, and several related charges. Diane faced charges that included the same, along with charges related to the procurement and use of the controlled substance. Their attorneys spent considerable effort trying to negotiate, and I was told there were moments when the situation might have resolved differently. I made my position clear to the prosecutor's office, which was that I was not interested in a resolution that did not involve accountability, and I was prepared to testify fully and in detail if that's what accountability required. I did not go to the courtroom every day. I went on the days that mattered. I sat in the 3rd row for Marcus's sentencing, which was where I had sat at his high school graduation all those years ago, though the feeling in my chest was not what it had been then. Marcus stood with his hands clasped in front of him while the sentence was read, and at one point he turned and looked at me over his shoulder, and I looked back at him steadily, and I don't know what either of us was saying to each other in that moment. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything that could be said between 2 people whose entire history had been quietly rewritten by an evening on a boat. Diane received a separate sentence. I was not present for that one. What I did with the grief of it is harder to describe than the legal facts. There is a particular kind of loss that doesn't have a proper name. The loss of someone who didn't die but who turned out never to have been who you believed they were. You grieve something that may never have actually existed. You grieve the 11-year-old boy who cried at my kitchen table the night his parents' marriage finally ended. And you grieve the man at the altar. And you grieve 43 years of believing that something you built, not just a business but a family, had turned out to be real. My grief counselor, a patient woman named Dr. Simmons, whom my cardiologist recommended and whose office I initially entered with every intention of attending exactly once, helped me understand that these two things can both be true at the same time. That Marcus and I had something real, and that he made choices that destroyed it. Both things. At the same time, I sold the waterfront property 6 months later. Too many evenings of sitting on that porch and looking at the water and thinking things I didn't want to keep thinking. I bought a smaller place further inland, a house on a lake with a screened porch and a dock and a canoe I take out on Sunday mornings when the mist is still on the water. It is quieter than my old life, and smaller in most of the ways that used to matter to me, and I find that I don't miss the scale of what I had as much as I expected to. I think about Tommy often. He was 24 years old, and he'd been working charter boats for 2 seasons, saving money to put himself through a marine engineering program at a college in Pensacola. He had student loans and a small apartment shared with 2 roommates and, as far as I could tell, no particular reason to get involved in a stranger's problems at the cost of his own employment and comfort. He got involved anyway. I called Captain Ernest 2 days after everything happened and asked about Tommy. And Ernest confirmed that Tommy had not lost his position on the Magnolia, that Ernest had in fact made clear to the vessel's owners what Tommy had done and what it had taken for a young man his age to step up in that way, and that his job was secure. I was glad to hear it. But secure employment on a charter yacht was not, in my assessment, an adequate expression of what Tommy's courage had been worth that evening. I contacted the marine engineering program in Pensacola, and I paid Tommy's remaining tuition in full. All of it. The remainder of his program, plus his living expenses for the time it would take him to finish, arranged through the school's financial office, so that it arrived as a scholarship designation rather than as something that would embarrass him or create a complicated obligation. I included a letter which the school agreed to pass along without my name attached, if that was Tommy's preference, though I was told he did eventually want to know who it was from. He called me on a Thursday evening in March, about 4 months after the charter. He was on a break between classes, and he sounded young in the way that people in their mid-20s sound when they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing with their lives. He thanked me in a way that was direct and unadorned, without excessive emotion, the way someone thanks you when they mean it rather than when they're performing gratitude. I told him he had been braver than he knew, and that I hoped he understood that what he'd done mattered beyond just me. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "My grandmother is about your age." I thought about her. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I have been asked by people who know what happened, the friends who heard the story, and the distant relatives who heard a version of it, whether I feel angry. The answer changes depending on the day. Sometimes what I feel is closer to a specific, cold sadness, the kind that doesn't peak and doesn't dissipate, but simply sits in a particular room of your interior life that you learn to walk past. Sometimes I feel something that might be gratitude, which seems strange given the circumstances, but which I think has to do with the clarity that came afterward, the understanding of what I actually had and what I had only believed I had. What I don't feel, and this has surprised me, is regret about the years I invested in Marcus. I fed that child. I drove him to school. I sat in hospital waiting rooms when he had his appendix out at 14. Whatever calculations he made about what I was worth to him, whatever series of compromises he accepted until he was sitting across a table from me on a boat watching his wife pour something into my glass. I don't believe those years were wasted. I believe I did what a decent man does, which is show up for the people in his life without keeping a ledger of what he's owed in return. I believe that. And I also believe that an adult is responsible for the choices he makes regardless of what kindness he was shown. Both of those things are true. I've had to learn to hold them both. What I know about myself now that I didn't fully know before is that I built something over 43 years that was worth betraying. That sounds like a strange thing to be grateful for. But there is something in it, some validation of the work, that I find I return to on the harder days. I built a fleet of 14 commercial fishing vessels from one second-hand trawler and a loan I had no business taking out, and I sold it for $5.5 million. And two people who called me family thought it was worth risking their freedom and my life to take it. That means it was real. That means it mattered. The canoe goes out on Sunday mornings in all weather that allows it, and sometimes I take my fishing rod, and sometimes I don't, and the lake is not the Gulf, but it has its own kind of beauty, the kind that asks less of you than the open water does. I sit out there in the early morning quiet, and I watch the mist move, and I think about Margaret, and I think about what 43 years looks like when you lay it out. And I think about an 11-year-old boy who used to fall asleep on my couch during football games and wake up asking what the score was. And I think about a young man named Tommy who was 24 years old and had a grandmother about my age, and who decided on a warm November evening on the Gulf that the right thing to do was worth the cost of doing it. I think about that more than almost anything else. There is a family of herons that nests on the far side of the lake, near a stand of old cypresses that lean out over the water. 3 of them, I think, though I can rarely see more than 2 at a time. They fish in the early mornings, along the shallow edge near the cattails, moving with that particular patience that herons have, standing perfectly still for minutes at a time until the right moment comes, and then moving with a speed that startles you every time, no matter how well you think you've prepared for it. I watch them on Sunday mornings. I have learned something from them about stillness and about patience and about the value of waiting until you can see things clearly before you decide how to move. I am 67 years old. I have no boats and no business and no operational infrastructure and no logistics coordinator and no dock managers. And I have a house on a lake and a canoe and a screened porch and a fishing rod and more mornings than I know what to do with, which turns out to be exactly the right number. I still have the letter Tommy sent after the school, forwarded my contact information to him, a handwritten note on plain white paper in the unadorned handwriting of a young man who had better things to do with his evenings than perfect his penmanship. I keep it in the drawer of the side table, next to the chair I read in, and occasionally I take it out and read it again, not because the words change, but because some things bear repeating. "You didn't owe me anything," he wrote. "I just did what was right. I did what was right." 7 words from a 24-year-old deckhand who thought about his grandmother and who understood, without any complicated reasoning or private calculation, exactly what those words required of him. I have spent a great deal of my life building things: boats, routes, contracts, a company, a family that turned out to be something other than I thought. What I understand now, standing on the far side of all of it, is that the things worth building are the ones that last past the moment when they stop being convenient. Trustworthiness, decency, the particular courage of doing the right thing when no one would blame you for looking the other way. Those are the only things I have seen hold. Everything else, the money, the fleet, the waterfront property, the belief that love obligates love in return, all of it can be taken from you faster than you ever expect by circumstances or illness, or by people you would have trusted with your life. But no one can take from you what you chose to be in the moment it mattered. I know that now. I know it the way you only know things that have cost you something to learn. The herons are out this morning, 2 of them, standing in the shallows with that extraordinary patience. The mist is still on the water. My coffee is warm. The canoe is tied to the dock, and the fishing rod is leaning against the post. And the morning is very quiet. And I am, against most reasonable expectations, at peace.